Chelsea. Jeffers, Captain Worktas, for the community again. My spirit name translates to Spirit Keeper of the Stars woman, and I'm from the Fish Clan. And as Mavis mentioned, I live in Toronto. I've been in Toronto for over 30 years, but I'm originally from Alberta. It is an absolute honor and privilege to be invited to speak. To be invited by Tracy, who I only just met last week, so I feel like I'm in a ton of work. And I absolutely want to honor the land and territories that I stand on. So in March 2006, the federal, provincial, territorial ministers responsible for the status of women basically convened a summit. And it was held in Ottawa, Ontario. And over 250 delegates representing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis organizations, advocates, policymakers, and government officials gathered to address three themes. Basically, raising awareness, access to programs and services, and policy and research. And I was one of the representatives from the Ontario delegation that went to that policy forum, the National Policy Forum. Interestingly enough, at the same time, in the province of Ontario, the province of Ontario released the 2006 Domestic Violence Action Plan. The organization that I work for always looks at everything, anything that the government releases. And we look at it, and we basically wrote a position paper and deemed that the Domestic Violence Action Plan in Ontario was absolutely unacceptable. It did not reflect Aboriginal women's experiences of violence, and it absolutely did not reflect anything about moving forward from what we believe within our own Aboriginal worldview. So after that national summit in Ottawa, the Ontario Women's Directorate, which is housed under the Minister responsible for women's issues, invited the Aboriginal women delegates that went to the summit. And we basically started to talk to them about gaps in services, access to services, the justice response. And they responded by funding our very first summit, 10 Violence Against Aboriginal Women in the province of Ontario. And so there we brought, most importantly, Aboriginal women together, policymakers, government officials, Aboriginal organizations, women's councils, First Nation leadership representation, and we had a dialogue. And again, we talked about always the same themes. What are the gaps in policy? What kind of programs do we need? How do we need to move forward as a united front in order to address violence against Aboriginal women? So as a result of that summit, the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres and the Ontario Native Women's Association wrote a strategic framework. We basically launched and wrote a strategic framework to end violence against Aboriginal women. The strategic framework is guided by 11 principles, and of course, the number one principle is that all violence against Aboriginal women must stop. The framework addresses 8 very specific areas for change, and they are in the areas of research, legislation, policy, programs, education, community development, leadership, and accountability. And basically what we did was, at that time, in the very beginning, the presidents of Ontario Native Women's Association, the president of the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres, met with every single one of the 13 ministers that signed on to the Domestic Violence Action Plan to present our strategic framework. The executive directors of both those organizations then met with every single deputy minister and every single assistant deputy minister in the province of Ontario to those 13 ministries to basically present again our strategic framework. So what happened as a result, and what happens is the work never stops. And I was really enjoying Gail speak because she started to talk about relationships. And my culture would talk about Wakotuan is about relationships and that all things are related. We are all interconnected. And it is absolutely about relationship building. So you can imagine, since we released this, that every time there's a cabinet change and there's a new minister, there's a new deputy minister, a new assistant deputy minister, that you better believe we've got a letter out to them, welcoming them to their positions, but also asking to meet with them so we can share with them our vision to end violence against Aboriginal women. So after the first summit, it became clear to us that there was more work, obviously, to do. And the second summit was hosted by the Ministry of Attorney General. And so at that summit, again, inviting all relevant stakeholders, most importantly Aboriginal women themselves, to talk about the intersection between violence against Aboriginal women and the justice system. And so a whole set of recommendations coming out of that. The third summit that we hosted the next year was hosted by and funded by the Ministry of Community and Social Services. So very much looking at the shelter system, counseling services, transitional housing, and making again the links between those services and violence against Aboriginal women. What was really important about that particular summit was that when we talk about relationships, Chief Bill Montour, one of the largest First Nation communities in Ontario, perhaps in Canada, I believe, some Mohawk Nation, read a resolution to the delegation. So this was very landmark. The resolution signed by 12 chiefs in the province, primarily male chiefs in the province of Ontario, basically signed a resolution supporting the strategic framework to end violence against Aboriginal women. This was very, very landmark in our province because we know within our First Nation communities that violence against Aboriginal women is not number one on the priority list. It is about clean water. It is about housing and everything else. So these 12 First Nation communities actually, they have the largest population base of all First Nation people living on reserve, live on those 12 First Nations. So to have the endorsement that they could put the politics aside and that they could indeed partner with 3 urban Aboriginal organizations, that being the Ontario Federation of Indian Correctional Centres, the Ontario Neighbourhoods Association, and by then the Métis Nation of Ontario had signed on as well. Just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we held our 4th summit, and it was funded by the Ministry of Children and Youth Services. And of course, if you know the demographics, we all know the demographics of our population in Canada, in that over 54% of our people are under the age of 54, and that work that must be done in order to engage and educate and bring our youth along in ending violence against Aboriginal women, but also the atrocities of the amount of our children that are in state care in Canada exceeds the amount of people that are in residential schools. So we did that big conference, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, and I came up with yet a whole other set of recommendations, and the sun is shining in my eyes. There's some people in the podium over there. So I wanted to, the strategic framework is in the language that the government can understand, and that's why we wrote it, right? So that, when we're meeting with the ministers and the assistant deputy ministers and the deputy ministers, that this is language that that they can get, that they can relate to. So obviously, we've had a lot of summits and a lot of recommendations. You can imagine the number of recommendations that are coming out of all these summits. But I wanted to say that we did yet another analysis of all the recommendations, and there were 10 recommendations that are being consistent across the board. And I want to share what those are with you. So we believe in the province of Ontario that a community-based cultural and holistic healing approach is used when addressing violence against Aboriginal women, where community members are helpers, where women are protected, men are held accountable, and healing programs are available to them, that the family is not disintegrated, and that healing processes are in place for children. Number two, that we must address the needs of the victim, the offender, and the family in the context of the community. Number three, that the continuum of care is the working model for ending violence against Aboriginal women. Then number four, all parts of the life cycle are considered, as is the diversity of Aboriginal people in those programs on reserve, rural, urban, and Métis. We believe, as a recommendation, that we must increase the government's capacity to understand that Aboriginal communities are all unique. We have different ways of functioning. We must understand how the Métis are organized. They must understand that. They must also understand and know that violence against Aboriginal women is neither a jurisdictional nor a political issue. It is inclusive of all Aboriginal peoples. And that we must take politics off the table when we're talking about the protection and safety of Aboriginal women. So in my province, in the north, we have about 52, 53 flying communities, and there are no services for those women. Another recommendation was that government consultation processes for policy development would be based on community needs and community needs only, and that they must be designed around Aboriginal protocols. Another recommendation was that government and Aboriginal organizations should include culturally relevant, gender-based analysis in all decision-making, legislation, policy, and program development that affect Aboriginal women. Huge issue that was a theme yesterday in the workshop I delivered, that another recommendation was that our own leaders, community leaders, are actively leading in the work to end violence against Aboriginal women. Another recommendation that came out of all those summits was that funding agencies should make it mandatory for all Aboriginal communities, agencies, and organizations who receive funding for programs and services related to violence against Aboriginal women be required to commit to the adoption and to be held accountable for the implementation of the strategic framework to end violence against Aboriginal women. And lastly, recommendation that was repeated over and over again was that Aboriginal women regain their rightful place in both the family and community and are seen in the mainstream and in the Aboriginal community in their primary roles and are no longer viewed as victims. So what has been the government response? For the first time since I've worked so closely alongside the government doing the work, they basically have, through the direction of the Premier of Ontario, formed what they call the Interministerial Joint Working Committee to end violence against Aboriginal women, and it is co-led by the Minister responsible for women's issues and the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. So we just finished writing the terms of reference, and the terms of reference also includes that we, as Aboriginal organizations, that we get an opportunity every year to meet with 13 ministers, or at the very minimum, these two ministers, Minister responsible for women's issues and Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, to share with them how we think we're doing. And most recently, we did write a report card back to the Government of Ontario, in our opinion, rating how they were doing and moving the framework forward. We gave the Government of Ontario a failing grade, not for their lack of engagement, because I would say that our engagement is very good. But for their lack of, they have endorsed the strategic framework in principle, but not in policy. And so that's ultimately what we're looking for. And in closing, I just wanted to basically acknowledge a few people. I want to acknowledge my mentor, my role model, an absolutely incredible visionary leader, and that is the Executive Director of the Ontario Federation's Indian Friendship Centres. Her name is Sylvia Miracle. She's Mohawk and Tyendinaga First Nation. She's so well respected. This was her vision. And because she's such a great strategizer and negotiator, she knew we had to bring our own people on board, that we can come in as a collective voice to speak to the government of Ontario. So I want to acknowledge her. I want to acknowledge the leadership of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And this is kind of new for them too, and they're women's councils now. They're trying to get them really build their capacity in addressing this issue. I want to acknowledge those 12 chiefs of the Independent First Nations for standing up and setting aside their politics and being able to endorse the strategic framework. And obviously the Ontario Native Women's Association as well. Most importantly, I absolutely need to acknowledge the Aboriginal women, and that's actually one of the principles that nothing can move forward with the strategic framework without us on board. And I also wanted to acknowledge the Tahltan women last night. I wanted to say that I was profoundly touched. My spirit was absolutely, completely filled up last night listening to these incredible, courageous, strong, powerful women, and their spiritual strength is something that we can all learn from. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, I really believe as a nation of people, all peoples, that we really need to heal our spirit. Because their spiritual strength is just something that, they go back to that land and we never, ever, ever got connected to the spirit of the land. And that indeed, if we can heal our spirits, we can raise our human consciousness and indeed end violence against women, as well as heal the Mother Earth. I was saying, which human skeleton I had